How we doing, my people?
Good, good.
How y'all doing? Y'all gotta pardon me. I'm from the spoken word community, so we used to like feedback and stuff. I don't do like library readings. You feel me? I need to know that you're with me.
Yes.
Some energy. I think that's very communist in nature. You feel me? I'm not up here by myself.
Yes.
All of this information comes from comrades who've been sharing it with me for weeks, for days, for months. And this past year, we've done a lot of growing together, and we hope that, you know, a lot of y'all will join us in these ranks and do some of this growing with us. And that requires participation and engagement. This is about more than just to sit and get. So I don't want to put my teacher hat on up here, but, you know, I don't see nobody taking no notes. So buku notes to get this ready for y'all. But if you can't do none of that, you know, if you're feeling something that you hear, you know, let's take it to the open mic real quick. What do y'all do when y'all feel something that resonates with you? Okay. Okay, and every once in a while it's going to get really complex and in the weeds because that's the nature of this work. And you don't want to miss a word, but you want to let the speaker know that you actually feel them. So you still give them a little bit of heat, give them a little friction for some of what they're offering. All right. Last but not least, sometimes this thing is like a sacred space. So in the spoken word world, we say church every time we feeling that thing really hit us in our gut. So you can say church, you can say mosque, tabernacle, you know, dojo, whatever it is you do. But if something hits you in the chest today, I want to hear you say that. On the count of three, let me get one of those from you. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Church. All right. Now that that's been clearly established, let's talk about the nature of this beast that we're confronting. The first thing we got to establish is that war is big business. It's a racket, as anti-war activist Smedley Butler once said, which is simply an old white man's way of saying it's a hustle. It's never about patriotism. It's never about nationalism. It's never about self-defense even. It's not about defending your mother or father country. What it's about, what it's always been about, is one nation brutalizing the shit out of another nation to rob its resources and or make the other nation work for it for the other nation's benefit. That's capitalism. 101. Sounds like the shakedown to me, but hey, was a hustle, right? It's only gotten worse in the last 100 years of American empire, as Greg was just talking about. So bad, in fact, that if America indeed is a prison nation, we have the COs out here snitching on the wardens. That's how bad it's gotten. Enter Exhibit A. This guy's name is Lawrence Wilkerson. All right? You probably can't. That wasn't the joke. Or you laugh if you will. If it makes you laugh, go for it. Got to steal our joy back in the nature of this beast. He said this like 2 days ago on Democracy Now! He said, ever since 9/11, the beast of the national security state, the beast of endless wars, the beast of the alligator that came out of the swamp that Trump said he was going to drain and turned around and hit Donald Trump in his ass is alive and well. America exists today to make war. How else do we interpret 19 years of war with no end in sight?
Yes.
It's part of who we are. We're going to lie, cheat, and steal, as Pompeo is doing right now. As Tim Cotton is doing right now, as Lindsey Graham is doing right now, and a host of other people in his party, the Republican Party, are doing right now to continue this war complex. When Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, Trump was a member of that national security state in very good standing, and all that state knows how to do is make war. Now, that's one of them ain't that crazy kind of moments for me personally, because I'm like, dude, you're a part of this beast. This guy co-wrote the speech with Colin Powell about weapons of mass destruction that got us in Iraq in February 2003. So if he's got that to say, then what is it that we should be having to say as progressive organizers on the ground? We should be able to flip this thing upside down, inside out, and on his head.
Yes.
Because if this ain't the case of the snow calling the cocaine white, I don't know what is.
Right?
Come on.
Yeah, you're right.
Now, while his anti-war sentiments may make your mouth drop harder than the coke jar, his notions are anything but new. Pardon all the coke references. But they just seem appropriate when you're dealing with the subject of violent thugs who take control of people's territory for profit. I digress. About 70 years ago, President Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell speech warned the nation to, quote, guard against the rising acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex, which was essentially the teenage version of that national security state that Wilkerson was talking about. 50 years ago, that thing was just getting ramped up. Now it's a full-grown beast. It's hard to contain.
Yes.
It's funny, however, that Eisenhower said that on the heels of overseeing at least 6 proxy wars under his 2-term watch himself. The invasions of Korea, Iran, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Syria, and Egypt all happened under his watch, but more on that later. Even before two-tongued Eisenhower, there was the more straight-shooting anti-war activist I mentioned earlier, Smedley Butler, who said, "War is a racket." I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of this country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general, and during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism, says a former major general of the Marine Corps who served in World War I.
Come on.
If that ain't the snow calling the cocaine white, I don't know what is. So what were Wilkinson, Eisenhower, and Butler talking about exactly? Well, just like any corrupt business, to figure out what's going on, we have to follow the money. Profits, dividends, and the resources that procure them are the #1 reason the U.S. goes to war. This country has been in existence 244 years, and for 228 of them, it's been at war.
Yes.
Why the need for constant war? Well, like Greg was talking about, because capitalism requires expansion of markets. And in the search for new markets, the U.S. military has occupied over 2/3 of the world. There are 195 countries on this planet, according to some old white guys' maps in the UN. 133 of them are occupied by the military, according to one source. Another source shows a map that shows even more than that. In some sort of representation, almost the entirety of the planet is occupied by the U.S. military. At least 67% of this planet for a country, a nation that only constitutes 5% of the population. If that ain't an inflated sense of self, I don't know what the hell is.
Come on.
Meanwhile, it's tried to overthrow some 56 countries since World War II and successfully did so in 36 of those cases. Every time a country falls to U.S. imperialism, it essentially becomes a new market to be used for its resources at the whims of the U.S. and the European banks like the IMF and the World Bank and oil companies like BP that Greg talked about that back our government's actions. And what are these resources our country so greedily seeks? Well, for that we can look to some of the top industries in the world, which include oil, mineral resources, pharmaceuticals, and more. But let's just start with the oil. Oil constitutes $2 trillion industry worldwide, making up 2 to 3% of global GDP, which is about $81 trillion. That's more than all the raw metal markets combined, by the way. So you're talking about gold, diamonds, cobalt, all of that good stuff that we go to Africa and loot and steal from the people out there. That whole market is still smaller than oil, which is about $1.7 trillion. Most importantly, from raw metals to textiles to mineral resources, whatever we're talking about, many other industries literally could not run without oil, obviously because they got to use the vehicles to get their stuff around. So who controls the oil controls the foundation of much of global economy. Yet, of the top 10 countries that hold the greatest oil reserves, 7 of them are countries that are either not under the control of the U.S. as a neo-colony, or better yet, they have an antagonistic relationship to U.S. imperialism. This list includes sovereign nations like Russia, Venezuela, Iraq, Kuwait, and you guessed it, Iran. As a matter of fact, other than Saudi Arabia, which is no more than the U.S.'s Middle Eastern lapdog, and Canada, the U.S.'s lame duck allied neighbors who assist in U.S. imperialism, Venezuela and Iran hold the #1 and #4 spot of the top 4 oil reserves holding countries in the world. And we wonder why the U.S. just happens to have so many problems with these stubbornly independent nations. Meanwhile, out of the top 10 oil companies in the world, only 3, numbers 5, 7, and 10, Exxon, Chevron, and Phillips 66, are U.S. based. I hope y'all follow me on this, all right? What we're saying here is that the rest belongs to China and Britain, with 1 in Russia, in terms of the top 10 oil companies, all right? Here we have China and Britain predominantly splitting up an oil market that mostly belongs to the Middle East, who have been #1 in oil production since the end of World War II, by the way. America hit peak oil in 1974, so they have a reason, these greedy capitalists, to be at the bay of all these other countries, right? And so most of the Cold War that we grew up hearing about wasn't only about the fight between capitalism and communism, but it was just as much for control of the resources that the greedy U.S. capitalists feared would be controlled by the people closest to them. The ones on their own oil-rich land in the Middle East and their Chinese neighbors that they would have and still continue to trade with just as much, if not more, than the U.S. as it's steadily rising. So if you ever need to understand the U.S. government's relationship to Israel or Saudi Arabia, or why the U.S. had beef with Iran since 1959 when Mossadegh tried to nationalize the oil, it's because some folks are willing to be our government's patsies and others won't stand for that shit, point blank, period.
Yes.
When it's not oil, our government's fingers are drooling over its raw metals, or mineral resources like gold, iron, cobalt, coltan, diamonds. See any nation in Africa where your laptops and cell phones parts come from for receipts on that branch of imperialism. Look further and see the recent lawsuit against Microsoft, Google, and other tech giants for their murder of some 14 youth in the Congo who died in their dangerous mines harvesting those resources I just mentioned. Yes. See Obama's AFRICOM agenda to find out how our military procured space for those corporations to move as exploitatively as they do in the first place, which brings us back to the military-industrial complex. You can't talk about these trillion-dollar industries and the ways that the U.S. cashes in on them without talking about the hired thugs, as Smedley Butler called his own U.S. soldiers a century ago, that are sent out to terrorize our black and brown siblings overseas and seize their lands for the resources that turn into profits for big corporations later. Now, while these industries run in the trillions, our military budget isn't far behind, weighing in at a record $718 billion this past year alone. Where does all that money go and how does it affect imperialism and big business? We'll just take a look at the stock market every time we invade another country. Look at Tesla's stock prices after their key resource, lithium, for the batteries that power their electronic cars, became more available in the wake of the Bolivian coup. Take a look at the top weapons companies like Lockheed Martin, number 1, Raytheon, number 4, Northrop and Grumman, number 5. Look at how their stocks rose by 2 to 8% the day after Soleimani was assassinated. Why? Because stock prices are based on predictions of how the markets are going to move. And after Trump ensured more military activity in the Middle East, they all knew they had a payday coming. So if this is how the infrastructure, the military-industrial complex works, we can be pretty sure that anything that any president in this country has ever said, particularly in the last 100 years, is a lie. But just so we have as many receipts as possible, because we know our evidence is the way that we stock up, right, our revolutionary mind state. And we can slice through all this bourgeois BS that we see on MSNBC, CNN, We Gonna See, and all the other BS that they be projecting on us on cable networks and whatnot. This is why we have to do our own research. Well, let's look at some of the receipts from how the military-industrial complex played their dirty hand over the last 100 years. Into the arena, the war arena. It's 1945. Only a year after the end of, no, it is the same year as the end of World War II, only months after its ending. The Japanese had just been expelled from Korea. One of the many territories that, like Greg said, in Asia were occupied during the war by Japan. Now, because Korea sits directly under the Soviet Union, who are the real heroes of World War II, by the way,
come on,
who had just sacrificed some 30 million lives in the defeat of fascist Nazi Germany, the U.S. capitalists felt threatened by the rising communist power of the Stalin regime, and they looked on Korea as another potential foreign colony that could give the strategic positioning that they needed against their communist enemies in Russia, while also advancing U.S. capitalist foreign interests, which is just a nice, sneaky way of saying military-backed corporate takeovers that yield them money. They negotiated with Russia to split up a whole island of people who had been united for thousands of years prior to U.S. invasion. They propped up a Western-educated tyrant named Sum Young Lee in 1948, who in the name of freedom and democracy massacred thousands of communists in South Korea. This was not unique. The same thing was done in Indonesia about a decade later, about 1 million communists killed there. The same thing has been done all across the so-called southern, whatever the term is for all of us non-white Western countries, right? From South America to Southeast Asia Pacific. Whenever you don't hear about this, but you do discover there's been a big clash, it's probably because they had a resistance already gone. This is a pattern. So inevitably the war ensued 2 years later when the communist leader that the Soviet Union supported, Kim Il-sung, tried to reunite his country. President Harry Truman sends in 50,000 troops from not only the US, Australia, Britain, and other so-called allied countries. And he literally called it a police action. Hold on to that. There's a message in that later. And the war wages on for 3 years as US troops slaughter millions of Koreans, many of them civilians, in the North and the South that they claim to be supporting, because the U.S. military top brass literally instructed them to do so. Ultimately, the war yielded no winner, and the North and the South agreed to live in a tense standoff disguised as peace for what has now been the last 67 years. So next time you hear about North Korea's nuclear threat and what bad guys they are, remember who meddled in their backyard in the first place to make them take such a defensive stance. Remember that the U.S. possesses and distributes more weapons, nuclear included, and maybe we had a little picture of that, than all of the so-called developed nations combined. So if you put their so-called allies together, Britain, France, and all of these different European countries, they couldn't wave $1 at what the U.S. spends on nukes all the time. And if we turn around and tell Iran, stop developing your nukes. Tell Korea, stop developing your nukes. But you already see the history of their track record. You would have some nukes too if you thought big, Broad Street Bully was coming for you. Come on.
Yes.
They are literally screaming murder with blood on their hands and millions of corpses in their closet. We must remember that. And we should research and know and remember the Gulf of Tonkin as well. The Gulf of Tonkin is the infamous lie that history books like to smother, but that lies at the root of the Vietnam War, which comes only about a decade and a couple of years after the Korean War. This war was fought in a country that, like Korea, most U.S. soldiers couldn't even place on a map. But after the U.S.-backed French army, let me say that again slower, the French army that occupied Vietnam for 20 years from 1944 to 1964 was backed by U.S. dollars. After they failed to suppress, once again, a communist uprising in the form of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, the U.S. made it their business to invade Vietnam. Like the Korean War, they did this under the guise of freedom and democracy. But it was really because, like President Dwight Eisenhower said on videotape, y'all can Google this, if we lose Vietnam, we lose access to the tink and the tungsten. Now, I don't know what the hell tink or tungsten is or what it does, but it's obviously a valuable mineral resource because it's in the ground in Vietnam. They have been pillaging it and stealing it from the natives for decades. All right? Same thing they've been doing in Africa since they carved it up. And so, unlike the Korean War, though, the U.S. didn't wait for the UN to sanction them in their invasion. So, Truman was the good imperialist. He went and asked for permission before I waged genocide on you. Eisenhower, he was just good, and he goes and kills you. And I'm sorry, that was terrible. I'm so sad and traumatized from all this. Well, we should stop doing this. The money keeps stacking, though. I ain't stopping nothing. Right? But when we get to Kennedy, another good liberal Democratic politician, and we get to 1964, things change up a little bit because they don't ask for permission. Instead, they cooked up a story about how the Navy ship that they had sitting on the coast of Vietnam, and y'all can see that right there. Just like we have a Gulf, they had a Gulf right there, and they love port, cities and port countries because they're mineral rich. They're also an access point to all of the lands they want to conquer afterward. And they had, American ships, warships, sitting on the Gulf. Now, if you're from the hood like I'm from the hood, somebody just stand right in front of you and stare at you and look at you for a long time. They're not being friendly. It's not because they like your face. They try to start something, okay? So we're talking about U.S. warships that were just sitting there hovering menacingly, all right? A country that's been under attack for 20 years, all right? And they're waiting for them to do something. And God forbid they do. Because if you stay at me long enough, I'm going to swing too. But they didn't even do that. And yet this is how it transpires. The hands of administration get passed from Kennedy to Lyndon B. Johnson. And good old LBJ, MLK's friend, I almost say that. The guy who signed the Voting Rights Act. He cooks up a little scheme. He cooks up a story about how the Navy ship that they had sitting on the coast of Vietnam had been fired at by Vietnamese warships. Oh, he was trying to hit me. Okay. And yet, the Navy's sonar man who served duty the night of the alleged attack, his name was Patrick Park, you can look this up, he went on record saying, "I'm certain there wasn't anything to shoot at right from the beginning." Quote, "The Air Force pilot and Commander James Bond Stocksdale went on record as saying, I flew so there was salt spray on my windshield and I didn't see anything." You know how close you got to fly to the water for you get the salt spray on the windshield of your plane? Senator William Fulbright, for all my Fulbright scholars out there, said the events as they related them on August 4th, 1964 were simply not true. It was not an attack at all. And yet, just recently in the beginning of the 2000s, the White House tapes were released that said, quoting Lyndon B. Johnson, "I want to kill the sons of bitches," in regards to the Vietnamese people. He says this to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at the time. Robert McNamara replies by saying, "I'll bring something back to meet that objective." The Gulf of Tonkin was what he brought back to meet that objective. Y'all see this? Now, it's one thing to have a framework this steeped in lies, but when it trickles down to this level of malicious manipulation, right all up in your face, and it's recorded, and it comes out, you can see the empowerment and the type of privilege that a Trump would swagger about with, because Vietnam was the first publicly documented American war where they did all their war crimes in your face. But they didn't have the internet back then in ways that could make them get released so quickly. Nowadays, they just do it in your face anyway because they think we're not going to do nothing about it. But that's why we're here tonight, because we are going to do something about it. The rest is the history of an American Holocaust of 5 million innocent Vietnamese people, 4 million of them civilians. We must remember that. We must remember the 5 million murdered in Vietnam with weapons that our tax dollars bought. The Ears for Beers campaign that literally paid soldiers in beers for how many Vietnamese people's ears they returned to their generals. Pardon the lack of a trigger warning, but it's about to get nasty. But that's the nature of war. Remember the grandmothers, the children, the babies bombed out of their villages by indiscriminate hired thugs posing as soldiers, killing innocent working people at the U.S. military's command. And when the generals asked, "How do you know the murder victim was a member of the Viet Cong?" the soldier would respond, "Because she's dead." We must remember how similar that sounds to the police officer that murdered Eric Harris, not the one in New Orleans that we marched for only a couple of blocks from here, but the Eric Harris, the other black Eric Harris in Oklahoma that was murdered. That the police told, "Fuck your breath," after they shot him and detained him and ultimately killed him. We must remember the murder of Amadou Diallo 20 years ago, just yesterday, who the NYPD killed because they thought his wallet was a gun. And remember the countless thousands of primarily black and brown citizens in the US and worldwide who have lost their lives to state-sanctioned violence sponsored by white supremacist fear and capitalist need for control of our bodies and the land that they stand on. And how that same fear and need for control is what has driven the dozens of wars that have murdered millions of our siblings worldwide. Remember that as we resist war in Iran, that the CIA overthrew Mossadegh in '53 by hiring, as Greg told us, opposing sides to fight against each other, reminds me of the Bloods and Crips, and create riots in the streets and bring the fight all the way to Mossadegh's front lawn until both sides were backed by army tanks that bombed Mossadegh out of his home and out of his country and collapsed their state into a U.S. neo-colony for 26 years to come under the Shah. Remember that even the most recent riots in the streets of Tehran to this very day are being even now rumored to say to be CIA-backed and potentially operating under the same trickery that overthrew their government 67 years ago. We must do the diligent research and mindful watching of our enemy, the state, to know the stage for Iranian invasion was already set by Obama's sanctions, which is an act of war against Iran. Which only extended the sanctions that have been in place on Iran since 1979 when the Shah was deposed. Know that when Trump pulled out of Obama's nuclear deal, he ratcheted up those sanctions by cutting off Iranian oil trade, which is 70% of their GDP and income, by threatening other major countries around the world that they too would be cut off if they didn't play with the US and the Western powers. Know that Trump sent 14,000 more troops to adjacent countries to surround Iran. Well ahead of Soleimani's assassination, 3,000 more troops the day of the drone assassination, and none of this was by coincidence. We must know and remember that the capitalist class is always organizing, so must we. And as we do so, remember that, as Lenin said, it is not the business of socialists to utilize the younger and stronger robber to rob the older and fatter bandits, but the socialists must utilize the struggle between the bandits to overthrow all of them. Which I think y'all understand, but what he's saying is when imperial forces fight one another like they did in the 2 world wars, working class people should be finding ways to sabotage the arms manufacturers, to loot the factories and arm ourselves against these war criminals against humanity instead of doing their bidding to destroy our siblings overseas and fatten the pockets of our own oppressors. We must remember that as working class people, we have no allegiance to pledge to nations or their governments run by the rich ruling class. Corporations and the militaries they back do not know any borders, and neither should we. Because Eric Garner is Erica Garner, is Mario Franco, is Patrice Lumumba, is Che Guevara, is a working class miner in South Africa, is a rice planting grandmother in Vietnam, is a longshoreman in Iran. All our struggles are connected. If we can be bonded in our oppression, we must be bonded in our liberation. We are the workers of the world. we do the labor that makes this thing spin, and anytime we're ready, we can spin it off its wretched capitalist axis. Thank y'all.